Hi there, and welcome to this week's demo. So for those of you that saw Monday's tutorial session, I'll just do a little recap. So we've been looking at the relationship between tone and colour. So you might want to, if you haven't seen it, to have a look at my, I'll put the link here. You can go and watch my tutorial session I did on Monday. So I looked at the way in which tone relates to colour, okay, and we looked at two periods of art history that sort of really highlight these two approaches. First one was Dutch landscape painting from the golden age of Dutch landscape painting, which I think was the 17th century. So I gave a couple of examples there, and we looked at basically they tended to emphasize tone more than color. And so I was pulling out some color notes and, just noticing how muted their color palette was. So we looked at that, and then we went over and looked at French Impressionism, which was much higher emphasis on color over tone. And so what we saw there was, from a black and white tonal point of view, the paintings were actually very sort of quiet. So all the work was being done really by the intensity and interaction of colour values. So what my advice was for homework this week was to have a go at either both of these, but what I actually revised it to is if you were going to choose one this week, is to do the tonal painting first. So that's what I've chosen to do. So you can see my reference picture up here, which is, for those of you that know Suffolk, you probably recognise this spot. This is looking up to Southwold from Walberswick. And so we can see the water tower there, and there is a church. So I went through quite a bit of my reference material trying to find something I thought was appropriate, and in the end I sort of settled for this, and it's a slightly unpromising reference photo, but I like the idea of using these two styles to basically change the painting. So hopefully you'll see from here, this isn't just a straightforward copy, so I'm not like just trying to match colours and be as accurate as possible. I'm actually going to be, in my mind, I'm thinking Dutch landscape painting. So what you can see here is I've sketched in the main sort of shapes, as you can see, the trees and the water tower. What I'm just doing there and there, the ellipse on the ground, that represents, in my mind's eye, I'm thinking of where to put highlights. So I'm going to use this Dutch idea, which is to, as if having the landscape cast in shadow, and then have a few highlight areas where the sun has broken through. Okay, so that was one of the things I really liked from looking at their work. And the other thing which I'm doing is trying to keep my colours very muted, and also work ever so slightly from warm to cool. So thinking more like ochre, although that doesn't, that's not really picked up in my reference photo. So again, sort of an imaginative interpretation. A bit more ochre in the foreground, yellow ochre being a sort of warm mustardy yellow. Olivey neutral greens for my trees, and then cool greys and blues in the sky. So that was the plan I had in mind. So I was a bit quicker today with this one. This took me probably best part of 2 hours, I think, but I've speeded it up for you a little bit to make it a bit more bearable. And but I did get stuck in there. There was the main drawing aspect comes with that water tower and trying to get the scale of the small buildings in the distance. And I also like the water tower because it's silhouetted against the sky. So you've got a dark shape against a light ground. And then with the church, what I've done there is, again, creatively, I've made it read a little bit like it's more of an illuminated shape against a dark ground. So I'm playing with interchange there, which again is something you'll see from these Dutch landscape paintings. Counter change, light against dark, dark against light. It creates visual interest. So here I'm blocking in, this is my first sort of highlight area. As you see, breaking away somewhat from the reference material, but just trying to just think about how to lead the eye through the painting. So the challenge for next week is going to be, I'm going to try and paint the same scene using a more impressionist approach. So again, this will be interesting to see. The thing to consider is that if you took one of these Dutch landscape painters and put them in front of this scene, then they would be painting in their style. We see through our eyes, you know, until Impressionism was sort of discovered, as it were, or sort of unfolded, it wasn't like artists could suddenly sort of skip ahead to sort of gain all the insights that because they came about through very specific conditions. So this is what makes it really unusual for us as painters, is that we can look back at art history and we can sort of dip in and use all these different stages, different ideas and ways of depicting things. And I mean, what happens to these schools is, you have a few sort of geniuses that make the style particularly popular. And I mean, it's interesting looking at these Dutch landscape painting, because if you go into any sort of stately home or somewhere like that, you'll see paintings that borrow some of the ideas found in these sort of this style. So you get a style, someone sort of goes into it and creates some masterpieces, and then you get like generations of tiers of artists behind them who are sort of working in that style and sort of developing it and unfolding it. But yeah, this is normally the pattern it goes. Yeah, so I'm just looking at what's going on here, and I'm putting in my this is my sort of my other highlight is just down where the water tower is. I want that to be, that's a sort of a spotlight, and I'm thinking there of, again, desaturated green. So really sort of keeping my colours greyed and desaturated. And the way you do that is by mixing in complementary colours, or in this case, say I've got yellow, if I want to desaturate it, I can add in purple, or I can add umber or black, or if I just happen to have a load of paint on my brush, just rub that around in it and it will take it away from that very intense, fresh from the tube sort of colour. And because this painting relies a little bit more on these strong tonal effects, and it is partially, I'm using the reference, but I'm using it in a sort of more imaginative way, I was very keen to get the painting blocked in, because really until the overall tonal value is established, it's difficult to know how your highlights and shadows are working. So say the first pass is a bit of a rough in. It's you're just sort of trying to establish the structure of the painting. I was going to say avoiding the tendency to go back and fiddle, but as I'm doing a bit of that there, it just goes to show just refining it. And you can see at the bottom of the painting, that band of colour has got a bit more warmth in it. It's a bit more a reddish brown, and that was something I saw in all of those paintings really, which was that use of warm colours coming forward and cooler greys receding. And I was particularly keen with these sorts of scenes, having seen a lot of people painting in my classes. One thing I always have to sort of restate is you'll see this, it's basically you have to keep the object small. Now there's a little fast forward there, so as you can see I got a bit more stuck into the sky. Yeah, trying to keep the objects in the distance small, okay? There is a tendency for our eye to sort of zoom in and find those shapes so interesting that we want to make them larger. And of course, the larger they are, the more they come forward. So you almost have to counteract that effect and force yourself to make sure that everything in the distance stays a bit small, even if you need to use a very small brush. So as you can see, I blocked in my sky with those clouds. Trying to keep the tones all quite close and all basically like a mid value. So although the sky was light, looking at my reference, looking at the sort of Dutch painters, they weren't going up anywhere near white. So I've probably I've gone dark, but I'm trying not to go for white paint. So the colours that you see here all have bits of yellow and umber sort of mixed in with them. And you can see from the reference the sky is sort of completely invented really. So I sort of tried to sort of think my way through what would be some good shapes, and in the end I sort of put this blue in the middle to create some diagonals. So the diagonals are sort of helping to pull us into the composition and point towards the water tower. It's when you look at paintings, one thing you see very rarely is clouds that are just behaving in a horizontal manner. So this effect whereby the clouds are helping to create sort of more diagonal shapes that point into the composition is much more common. I mean, you will get like horizontal clouds nearer the horizon, but the top of the sky is normally characterized by diagonals. Not all the time, but it's just useful to look for that. The trouble with too much horizontal sort of lines in the sky is they just pull your eye out of the composition. It's why this scene is very much, it's got more horizontals than anything else. But my intention was that the highlights, like on the ground that I'm working on there, the highlights help to move the eye around the composition so we don't just sort of scan it side to side. So my foreground highlight is of course nowhere near light. It's much more of it's a mid value, but that's why the surrounding greens have to be quite dark and subdued. One thing I really enjoy, I think the colour palette, you know, looking at the colours from those Dutch painters really inspired me with this one, and I was pleased with the effect. I thought the subdued colours all were really harmonious in the way they sat together. You can see the background that I'm working in. These are all boards that I had primed sort of a couple of months ago now, probably before we started lockdown. And I primed them using burnt umber and white. It's interesting though, looking at them under this light, the background almost reads as a pink. And that's the power of complementary colours. It's because the overall painting on top now is cool, which means it's slightly blue. So as sort of colour relation works, that means that any colour that's left over is going to look slightly more orange. And as it's a warmish colour anyway, although it looks more like a brown under normal light, there it's serving to make it look a bit pink, which isn't a bad, you know, it's quite a nice complementary colour to these cooler blues in the sky. So I think even when I finished it, I left a little bit of that background colour showing through. And here we are just trying to block in this water tower. And this little part of the painting, it's one of the things that I've really enjoyed about lockdown and being able to spend a bit more time painting in my studio, is it gives me the space to sort of be a bit more patient with some of these detail areas. So it's very tempting, you know, to think impressionism and sort of just sort of get everything, you know, close, close as, you know, is good enough. But what I'm trying to do here is really look at the objects, look at, and get those proportions and everything as accurate as possible. As I said, I think last week, it's the striving to get these things right that actually really engages your brain and helps you get absorbed in your painting. So. And although with oils you can go back and change things, generally speaking, if you want to retain a sort of freshness to your painting, you really want to try and, as much as possible, get it right first time. Having said that, I think I did do a bit of tweaking here. If you can see on the reference picture, there's this pinkish light coming across. I think it's one of those things that the photo reference doesn't really do justice to what it was like when I was there. So there's almost, you can almost see pink in the lights and sort of slightly bluish purples in the shadows. So I'm already sort of thinking ahead to when I take it on in a more impressionistic style. And of course I'll be lightening those darks, so really narrowing the tonal range and maybe just going for blues and greys. So you'll be pleased to see I am looking, oh, I'm not looking now, but yeah, whenever you're trying to draw something with a degree of accuracy, it's important to make sure you're flicking your eyes up. The reason I keep darting off camera is, of course, to really sit back in my seat and look at it from a distance. You're not really going to be able to tell whether you've done a good job of these things when your sort of eyes are close up to it. You need to sort of see how it's relating to the whole canvas. It was interesting, even as I was painting this, consciously trying to keep my colours fairly desaturated. Just because of the way we mix colour, it's very easy to basically go too saturated with your colour. So I think it does take a little bit of conscious intention with this exercise to keep your colours subdued. This is where some of the tricks are. Where I mix my paints is on a grey ground, and that makes it a bit easier to appreciate the colour. But it's about becoming a bit subtle, learning how to just sort of nudge a grey ever so slightly towards blue. And that's that distant church. Which again, I was a little bit, I think, when you look at the reference material, oh, there was a bit of a fast forward. You can see a sort of, there's like a triangle. There's that foreground sort of shrub sort of sticking out of the field. That's a one. Then you've got the water tower and then the church tower. So there is enough there for it to serve a bit like a triangle, which will keep the eye moving around the composition. But I was a bit worried about creating too equal interest. And that's like a scale where you've got two equal amounts in each sort of thing, and it's completely balanced, and you don't really want that degree of balance. It divides the interest. So my primary interest is the water tower. And then the idea is you go to the little church on the side there. So things that help keep the water tower, it's a bit bigger. It's definitely dark against light, whereas the church is more like colour against, it's more of a warm against cool. And the cloud, the big yellow sort of highlight on that cloud is actually a diagonal that's pointing towards the church tower. So, sorry, to the water tower. And these little houses on the distance, this is quite a useful idea, which is that to have in your painting, you can have quite large areas in the foreground that empty space, you know, big sort of masses pointing inwards. And then on your horizon or in the distance, you can then go very small and suggest, like in this case, rooftops. But if you keep those marks small, then it really helps to, you're trying to bring out this sense of scale and that these things are really far away. But you're concentrating the detail in a very small part of the painting. So just sort of thinking about those green fields now. Again, that's where I want my light to be. And here we go. This is the sort of star of the show, as it were. This is the highlight on that field, and you can see how that really. So I'm sort of thinking that's my highlight, and it's suggesting a little beam of light just hitting that distant field there. And you can see it really helps to, it just takes the eye back into the painting. Even though it risks it, it slightly goes against the principle of high contrast in the foreground, but it's small enough that it should trick the eye to, we still read it as a distant light. And the other thing I'm doing is it's a green field, but I'm keeping the highlight, again, a very grey green. And that's, again, looking at those Dutch landscape paintings. I'm hoping to try and get out and do some painting on location in August. So I'm going to be having a bit of a break. So it'll be nice to get the pochade dusted off and try and go out and take some of. I've really enjoyed this landscape term. I say with my classes, we go in cycles, looking at still life, landscape, portraits, drawing, sorts of different subjects. And there is, they will tend to, will revisit these themes as the years go on. But on a personal level, I find each time I pick up these subjects, I'm learning something new. And as I say, it was last year, I think, was my 10th year of teaching art in and around Ipswich. So it just goes to show, going over some of these principles, the theory, it's not a case of you do it once and then you have to sort of relearn these lessons over and over again, and then eventually little pieces of the puzzle start to sort of slot together. But that's what makes it such a such an enjoyable pastime, I think, because there's never an end to it, and each of the little steps along the way, just to see a little bit of an improvement. Like even this painting, I was really pleased with this. It came off very well, and I felt I'd learned something. And so it keeps the whole experience really fresh, and so I'm sort of keen to go back the next day and see what happens. And so I think that's it's one of the important things about being an artist, or sort of learning to paint, is just to try and keep that sort of curiosity and enthusiasm. And you tend not to see the you don't see the improvement, I'd say, week to week or month to month, but when you look back over the years, you tend to appreciate that your work is definitely unfolding, sometimes in directions that you couldn't sort of normally, you might not have seen coming, but it is unfolding, and it's it's a really interesting process to watch. But say everything you do is helping. All the art you look at, even shows about art, even going for walks and sort of looking out the corner of your eye and asking yourself, would that make a good painting? Watching videos, even watching demos like this, everything is sort of, it's dripping in there. And one day you'll be painting a landscape and just a little idea or an intuition will come to you, and you won't perhaps remember where you sort of heard it or saw it, but it's all sort of being stored away there. Now here I was going to put a few posts. I did actually try a few ideas with this area, so this was all a bit experimental, but I thought at first it needed something to suggest some sort of diagonal. But I tried a few options, and in the end I was quite happy with it as it was. So, as is often the case, this is about as long as my camera runs for. So it died a couple of times. You can see there are a few little skips. So I carried on afterwards, not for too long, and just a little bit of tweaking and a bit of fiddling. Just really, but you can see the main gist of the painting has been established, and is often the case, is established really in the first, the first hour or so. Everything else is about fine tuning it and sort of seeing, well, what would help, what would make it better, what would make it worse, and just tidying up areas. And so it's always a dangerous period because you can easily sort of start to overstate things or get a bit carried away. But it's also really enjoyable because occasionally just little things just help to suddenly lift the whole painting. So it is, it's a nice part of the process. So here I thought about another sort of shrubby sort of thing, but no. No, I was happy for that to be quieter in the end. Just keep all the interest in the background. So here we are. Here's the finished piece. There we go. So as you can see, that nice effect of warm to cool. Warm in the foreground, keeping all those greens nice and subdued in the distance, and playing the dark water tower against a light part of the sky, and the other church tower a bit smaller, and more playing with colour there than tone. Okay, so that was my little theory there, and just a few little suggestions of those houses of Southwold poking through there. Anyway, yeah, so that was this week's. So I say next week I'll try and revisit the same picture, but in an impressionist style. But that's it for me. So I look forward to you handing in your entries on Thursday, and I'll be here on Friday morning for a review. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. Thumbs up, always much appreciated, and subscribe if you haven't done already. And I will see you again on Friday. Thanks a lot. Bye.